Today's video is sponsored by Geology. The 23rd of this month is the Xbox Series X gameplay showcase, and one of the big deals about this particular one is it's going to be focused on first-party games. Now, of those, the only one we actually know for sure exists is Halo Infinite. Everything else is one gigantic question mark. Now, chances are some of the games we're going to see are some brand new IPs to work with, but of course, everyone always has their dream wish list of what things Microsoft could potentially bring back. And there are some franchises that are still safely a part of the Xbox ecosystem. There's always going to be a new Forza, there's going to be a new Halo, probably not right away, but eventually we're going to see a new Gears of War. But this showcase just really got me thinking, what franchises has Microsoft not used in a while, and how cool would it be for them to make a comeback? And as I was reading in and researching a lot of these, there's a good reason why a lot of them probably aren't coming back. But let's just go ahead and talk about them. Some of them you're probably going to be able to predict or already know what I'm going to talk about. So let's start right away with something a little different, Crimson Skies. While not the biggest hit game on the original Xbox, Crimson Skies certainly has its dedicated cult fan base, so much so that the game did make an appearance as recently as E3 2017, not with a new game, but as sort of the premier title to show off the fact that the Xbox One was opening up backwards compatibility all the way back to the original Xbox, and Crimson Skies was that main game to really push, hey, you can start playing this on your Xbox One. Part of the real big appeal of Crimson Skies is it's a cross-section of a game genre and setting that we don't really get a lot of either of them actually, especially nowadays. It's a flight sim shoot-'em-up kind of deal, which we're getting a little bit of right now. EA is coming out with Star Wars Squadrons, but that's also, in space, tied to a very big-name franchise, whereas Crimson Skies is obviously a slightly more smaller-scale situation. But it also had this really heavy, pulpy feel. Almost think of like Indiana Jones, but focused on plane warfare, which nowadays, really the closest thing to that genre, at least as far as a big name game, is probably Uncharted. The point is that the game tapped into a very specific kind of feeling that no other titles really have, and it would be great to see it have another chance on a new system. But the chances of that happening are honestly pretty slim. The company that made the game, Fossa Studio, is no longer around. They went under after the release of Shadowrun on the Xbox 360, but it is worth noting that the lead dev from that team is still in the industry and has expressed interest on multiple occasions that he would love to work with Microsoft again on a new Crimson Skies. The most recent example of this being right after Crimson Skies was showed off at E3 2017. However, since then, the company he was leading, Harebrained Schemes, has now been absorbed by Paradox Interactive, so that adds a whole nother company that would have to be involved in the situation, and it just doesn't look like it's going to be a top priority for Xbox to bring back. Now, speaking of other original Xbox games we haven't heard from in a while, another great option is Fusion Frenzy. This was a multiplayer party game on the original Xbox that was a ton of fun. It was one of the better multiplayer options back at the time, especially as far as being a family-friendly choice, and it was basically just a combination of different mini-games where players would compete against each other to take first place. Now, part of the problem that Fusion Frenzy has is that while the original game on the original Xbox was a lot of fun, it did get a sequel on the Xbox 360 called Fusion Frenzy 2. That was not good. A big part of the problem for this is that it wasn't actually made by the same company. The original Fusion Frenzy came from Blitz, whereas Fusion Frenzy 2 was made by Hudson Soft. And that might give you the thought of, well, okay, cool, just make another one with the same original company. Well, again, Fusion Frenzy was quite a few number of years ago, and Blitz is no longer around. Now, like with Crimson Skies, this is another game that Microsoft is clearly aware there's at least some interest in having a new one in, because it is one of the few games that is backwards compatible on the Xbox One going all the way back to the original Xbox. And by the way, is also one of the best games to get a facelift as a result of it. This is another game where I think the chances of a surprise reveal are very low, but I think it'd be one of the ones that'd be a very nice surprise. I think something that Microsoft has definitely been kind of lacking a little bit on is on the family-aimed multiplayer stuff, especially recently, and I think that's a great fit for it. I highly recommend that if you did not play the original game before, check it out on the Xbox One. You can download it, it's backwards compatible. It does look a little outdated, but not as bad as it looked on the original system, and especially if you're kind of stuck in quarantine with family, great choice to play. Speaking of life during quarantine, I'd like to take a moment to thank Geology for sponsoring today's video. Since I've been staying at home a lot more, my diet's kind of been not as great, and my skin has suffered for it, but thanks to Geology's line of men's skincare, it has gotten a lot better. They make it really easy to start. You can take a 30-second diagnostic quiz on their website to figure out what you need help with for things like dark and puffy eyes, wrinkle lines, or just acne and oily skin, and then you can get started on a 30-day trial with their everyday face wash, their vital morning cream, an eye nourishing cream, and a revitalizing night cream. After the trial, you can figure out which products you want to keep using and order a 90-day supply. Either you can just buy out that much or set up a subscription and save a little bit more money. I've been using them for a little over a month now, and I definitely notice a difference, especially right under my eyes. Even my fiance has mentioned that my skin just looks a lot better. If you're interested in trying it out and using it yourself, check out the link down below for more info, and make sure to use the promo code Kevin30 to get 30% off your first 30-day trial, bringing the cost to less than $1 a day. Now let's get back to talking about some Xbox games. Alright, let's move on from original Xbox games. I still have one more I want to talk about, but let's also talk about something a little more recent and probably one of the most heartbreaking games on this list for me, Scalebound. Scalebound was one of the number of games announced for the Xbox One back in 2014 that ended up never really coming to life, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but for Scalebound in particular, it's a little bit of a mystery. The game was being co-developed with Platinum, who, as we know, has been very busy lately with a lot of other titles. They just re-released Wonderful 101 on the Switch, they're working on Bayonetta 3, they've got a whole lot of other projects in the works right now, but back in 2014, this was one of the biggest games on their plate until it was announced that they and Microsoft decided to stop working on it because it wasn't really living up to what they wanted it to be. If you somehow missed all the trailers and hype for this game back at the time, it was an action RPG where you had a dragon companion, like a full-size actual big dragon that you could customize, you had different abilities you could unlock, and the idea was that you would also eventually get multiplayer co-op where you and your friends could ride your dragons and take down these giant epic-looking bosses, which is a great sales pitch. Now, since the game's cancellation, it has come up time and time again where people think there are some faint signs of life that it might actually come back. It has been accidentally listed, there has been comments from Platinum employees in the past saying that they would love to work on the game still if they got the chance, and so people always kind of cling to the hope that this might happen, until very recently, Phil Spencer went out of his way to very cleanly shut down any chance of this happening.
We're not working on it. I'm not at Platinum today, but I'm almost positive they're not working on it. It's something we've all moved past, and it's not a moment that I see as a high point for me in my role, having to cancel a game that we had talked about for years. But yeah, for the people out there who are kind of thinking that maybe there's something still in the works, there's not.
Well, I like to think that nothing is impossible when it comes to games getting randomly revived thanks to the power of the internet. It has happened certainly many times before. That's definitely the kind of statement that doesn't instill a lot of confidence that even if it were to happen, it's gonna be anytime soon. Still though, I like to dream. As for an Xbox One game that did actually come out and hasn't had any word of a sequel since then is Quantum Break. Now this is another game that Microsoft was making in partnership with another third-party company, specifically Remedy, who's probably most popularly known, at least in recent years, for Alan Wake and Control. Going a little further back, you can also look at the older Max Payne games. And Quantum Break is an exclusive for the Xbox One that was one of the titles that was announced very early on the life cycle and got pushed back a couple of times and was part of their initiative of trying to do this really weird blending of entertainment. The idea is that it was a video game, but also mixed in with a TV show. You would play through these long segments of the game, you would make some kind of important decision, and then you would watch a straight-up episode of a TV show based on the decision you made and see the plot progress. Like Remedy's other games, it's a third-person action title mostly focused on shooting mechanics, but it also has a bit of the weirdness thrown in. Instead of being supernatural though, like in Control and Alan Wake, it was a time travel concept. Which, now that I think about it, still counts as supernatural, it's just a very specific genre of it. And I'm not gonna lie, I was never fully sold on the concept of mixing TV show and video game, and even once I played it, I wasn't a huge fan of that aspect of it, but the gameplay and overall storyline itself were excellent, not to mention it was a great looking game, and I would love to see Remedy take another stab at doing one of these titles. Now the chances of that happening anytime soon is pretty minimal. Right now they are of course still working on and releasing DLC for Control. They're also working on the single player campaign for Crossfire X coming out on the Xbox One, and they have a couple of unannounced projects they're working on that are being done with Epic Games. That much on their plate right now, I really doubt means that a Quantum Break 2 is happening anytime soon, and to be fair, Quantum Break is definitely the kind of game that would definitely get away with just being a standalone release where it has an open and shut story, but I don't know, it was a neat enough concept that I think if they just gave up on the TV aspect and focused on just doing another game with those mechanics, it could be really awesome. Next, let's talk about one of the really big elephants in the room when it comes to studios that Microsoft owns and IPs that they haven't made use of in a while, and that is everything having to do with Rare. Rare has had a very interesting history ever since they were bought out by Microsoft. They had a couple of individual, solid hits in the early years of the Xbox 360, like Cameo, Viva Pinata, Perfect Dark Zero, of course, and after that we entered in the early 2010s what I like to call the dark ages of Xbox history, also known as Better with Kinect.
Works. 1, 2, 3, go! Yeah, we love it. Okay.
During that time, they ended up just making a lot of Kinect sports games. They did have some involvement in the development of Killer Instinct, and more recently, they are probably best known for some Xbox One titles like their Rare Replay collection, which allows you to play some of their best IPs that haven't been used recently, and of course Sea of Thieves, which they are continuing to support. Now, I like Sea of Thieves, but I would be lying if I didn't say that there are a lot of IPs underneath Rare that I wish Microsoft would make use of in some way. And there's always those very little signs of life that there is some interest there. After all, again, Rare Replay is a thing they released on the Xbox One. Banjo-Kazooie has now been made a playable character in Super Smash Bros. And most recently is, of course, the Twitter debacle where a lot of people were thinking a new Perfect Dark game was in the works because there was a random new account made that was reserved and followed by a single Xbox employee, and it turns out that was actually just made by a fan, given this was in response to a reserved Fable account, which we'll talk about a little later. But the point is that clearly there is a lot of hope and demand for something in Rare's history to make a comeback, especially with times being what they are right now, where a lot of childhood favorites are randomly getting remade or getting new sequels. I mean, we've got titles like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil 2 getting remakes. We're getting a new Crash Bandicoot game after however many years. And so yes, something like a new Banjo-Kazooie or Conker's Bad Fur Day or of course Perfect Dark would all feel very welcome right now. But again, like so many titles we've talked about so far, the chances of something like this happening, at least for this next major event, are pretty unlikely. Rare is still working on and supporting Sea of Thieves, and they've already announced the next game they're working on called Everwild, planned to be released in 2021. Again, like with Sea of Thieves, I'm looking forward to play anything else they release, but there's always going to be this hanging question and thought in the back of the minds of anyone who grew up playing some of the other games: when is Microsoft going to make use of one of those older IPs? For our next game, I want to go back to talking about something from the original Xbox, and this one has had slightly more signs of life than some of the other original Xbox titles, not because it has backwards compatibility. You actually can't play the original version of this using Xbox One backwards compatibility, but it actually did receive a remaster during the same year, 2017. And that game is Phantom Dust. Phantom Dust was a cult hit on the original Xbox, not entirely in the same way that Crimson Skies was. The people that played Phantom Dust really loved it. It's just not a lot of people actually picked it up. And Phil Spencer even brought this up early on in the beginning of the Xbox One's life cycle in 2014, announcing that they wanted to do a proper full remake of the game, which then fell apart. The remake was going to be handled by Darkside Studios, and due to financial reasons just ended up not happening at all, and 3 years later in 2017, there was kind of this surprise launch of them still making a remaster of the original game. Not something that was going as in-depth and all out as the remake would have been, but still making a more playable version of the game today that was also free to play. If you've never heard of it, it's a pretty interesting game actually. It's a third-person action game primarily, but with collectible card game elements added in. It doesn't play like a card game. You're not playing on a match with just cards set down, but instead you collect different cards which are used for customizing your loadout for matches. While I am skeptical we're ever going to see an actual proper sequel of this game, like with a lot of the other games on this list, I am a little more curious what its chances really are. After all, Phil Spencer himself did express interest in wanting to bring this game back. They did end up bringing it back, just not in the way they had originally intended to. And so with the number of way more dev teams underneath Microsoft Studios now, I'm curious whether or not any of them could be handed the responsibility of working on not necessarily a remake at this point, because we already got that remaster, but something that's maybe more like a true actual sequel to the game. Again, I don't think the chances for this one are super high, but it's one of the more interesting ones to consider. A genre that has always had a very weird place in the Xbox ecosystem are JRPGs. They basically didn't exist on the original Xbox. Most of the Xbox One's life cycle, they were very heavily neglected aside from some big-name multi-platform releases like FF15, and more recently, near the end of the Xbox One's life, they have really been pushing adding more games and making a lot of games that were previously exclusive now multi-platform, like a lot of older Final Fantasy titles and even Kingdom Hearts. During the Xbox 360, however, there were actually quite a few JRPGs that were either timed exclusives or truly stayed exclusive for the Xbox 360, even if they were working with third-party companies like Square Enix and, more importantly, Mistwalker. Now, I bring this up because there isn't really one specific game I want to draw attention to. I just want to focus on the fact that there are numerous JRPG trademarks that Microsoft has access to that have not been used in quite some time. This includes titles like Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey, both from Mistwalker, as well as Infinite Undiscovery from Square Enix. Now, the problem with some of these is that in some cases, they weren't huge hits. Infinite Undiscovery in particular was not a super great game. And in the case of titles from Mistwalker, while those were pretty well reviewed, Mistwalker as a company has now ended up focusing much more on mobile games development. And even then, after making these Xbox exclusives, went on to make a number of games for Nintendo systems, including Blue Dragon titles for the DS, and The Last Story on the Wii. Now, part of the reason why there's always been this kind of disconnect between Microsoft and this genre is that if you've ever looked at sales of Xbox systems in Japan, it has never been, well, even noticeable. I mean, you talk about how much a system sells more than the other in a lot of different countries, but specifically in Japan, the PS4 well over 100 times outsells the Xbox One. And so as a result, that drives down a lot of the interest in making games like that. Now, I think Microsoft has become aware of the fact that clearly there are people who love that genre in the US and other countries, thus the push in adding a lot more games to the Xbox One's library that fall in that criteria. But I don't think it's enough to really give the kind of push necessary to enter more first-party deals like they were doing back during the time of the 360. I think a lot of the goal back then was to try and open themselves up to that market, and clearly, as system releases have gone by, it didn't really work. And on that note, another specific game I want to talk about, and I'm going to be very honest, it's not actually a great game, but I think it's a cool concept, and I think if it was re-explored, it could be done again right, and that's 99 Nights. 99 Nights is another game that was made by one of the various Japanese companies that Microsoft was working with during the 360 era, but instead of being an RPG, it was something much more in the style of a Dynasty Warriors game where it's this over-the-top action game where you're taking down whole waves of armies by yourself with a single character, except pushed to an even further extreme. I mean, most regular opponents didn't even put remotely the smallest bit of fight against you. It was usually the bosses that were the main challenge of the game. And when it came to regular enemies, you were just unleashing all these insane magic attacks that were super cool looking. Now, the game's had tons of problems. There's a lot of reasons why that they aren't particularly super well remembered for the Xbox, but I think that's a genre that does have its dedicated fan base. I mean, obviously with all the numerous crossover games that Dynasty Warriors has done, I'd be really interested in seeing that kind of style of game tackled just one more time for Xbox. I think with the right resources pulled into it and enough proper polish given, that is something that actually could stand out as something very different from the rest of the Xbox library and actually generate interest. Again, though, both the original games weren't particularly great, so I don't think there's much interest in trying to revive it. I think if they were even going to approach this genre at all, they would probably be better off just putting a brand new name on it, which I wouldn't blame and I would still very much like to see. For the 9th game on this list, I really want to talk about a title that absolutely pushed the graphical boundaries of what the 360 was capable of, and I want to see that happen again on the Xbox Series X with Hexic. I know it was a technical achievement for its time, and it's going to be tough to one-up that for the Xbox Series X, but I really want to see them make an attempt. Okay, obviously, look, I know it's just a simple puzzle game, but it was made by the same guy who made Tetris, and it is a very fun, excellent puzzle game. Honestly, both Hexic 1 and 2 are available on Xbox One backwards compatibility. You should play them and try them. It doesn't necessarily need an actual brand new game because puzzle games age very well, at least this style of game, but I would love to see one that just got a nice facelift, something that looked like a modern generation title. Not every single first-party release needs to be some kind of AAA ridiculous title. Sometimes I just want to mess around with a fun puzzle game that's got some relaxing music in the background, and Hexic was one of the best titles to do that back on the 360. Now, the game that I've saved for last is probably the most obvious title on this list, and it's also the title that probably has the best chances of actually getting revived in some form, is Fable. Fable was the exclusive RPG that Xbox had for their original system and 360, and while the first game I think did suffer a little bit from Peter Molyneux's very, very bad habit of overpromising and under-delivering, the game was still an excellent action-adventure title that when you look past some of its flaws and promises about what it could have been, you realize it's still a fantastic, quirky, weird, funny, and just overall enjoyable action RPG. We got 3 main games out of it that were a lot of good fun, and then we got to the Xbox One era, where again, during 2014, Xbox announced a lot of games that ended up not really actually happening. And for Fable in particular, they announced Fable Legends. This was not a traditional Fable game, but was instead going to be a multiplayer adventure that honestly, I actually thought was pretty fun. It did have a closed beta. I played it a little bit and enjoyed it, but Microsoft decided it was not good enough, and as a result, not only did the game not come out, but Lionhead Studios even closed down. Now, obviously, if they make a new Fable, it's not going to be from Lionhead, but this is one of the biggest IPs they have that has not been tapped into in quite some time, especially in a genre that doesn't have a great deal of representation when it comes to Xbox exclusives. Of all the games that have been used in a while, there have been plenty of rumors about this one making some kind of comeback for the Xbox Series X. This is probably one of the most rumored games to be revealed at their upcoming showcase. Now, like I mentioned earlier with Perfect Dark, there was that whole recent Twitter situation where people discovered a reserved handle for Fable, which does sound like that was an action taken by Xbox. Now, to kind of calm down any rumors tied to this, it was stated that this is kind of just a normal practice for IPs that they own. It is perfectly normal to reserve social media profiles that are tied to trademarks you own, and just to make sure that no one, uses them for bad things. And while that's true, you can't deny that the timing of that with this upcoming system and this upcoming showcase is definitely the kind of thing that would draw a lot of eyes to it. I have to admit that as far as all the games we've talked about on this list goes, Fable is the #1 game I would love to see a proper full return, because the IP has been used in some ways. They made a card game that was, not Hearthstone, and that's fine, but the whole reason I like Fable, what I fell in love with, was that original action RPG, and to have a new one with the kind of things we can do on modern systems would be something I would love to see, and I don't think that's a sentiment I'm alone on. When we talk about Xbox and exclusives and the whole kind of battle, one of the main things where Xbox fell really behind on PlayStation was just the fact that PlayStation released a lot more exclusive titles and made use of a lot of IPs that they have. Microsoft had some great exclusives on the Xbox One, but there just wasn't a lot of them, and a lot of them fulfill a very similar space. Gears of War and Halo are both great franchises, but they both scratch similar itches of being action shooter games. Yes, one is third person with cover controls and the other one is a first person view. I realize they're not the exact same thing, but at the end of the day, they still fulfill a similar overall genre that they need to try and start diversifying by either making some brand new games or bringing back some other IPs like Fable. Anyways, I guess the main takeaway here is there's a lot of IPs that Microsoft has not used in quite some time, some of which would be amazing to have come back, and I don't think the chances of a lot of them are very high, but that's exactly the kind of crazy surprise move that I think Microsoft really needs to pull off to turn the tide against PS5.